little discussion of these problems. The y equals 3/2 and 5/2 curves, which we've already constructed. If we go over here halfway between 1 and 0, and of course we know that's x equals 1/2, but I don't have to write that down. I don't really use that fact in determining where these points are, so why bother to write it down until maybe later when we do want to scale. And eventually we will, for example, do these estimates. Okay, so the x equals 3/2 curve and the 5/2 curve. Well, one of them kind of curves like this, and one of them kind of curves like this. We remember that from what we saw before. More specifically, the 3/2 curve is going to have y value 2/3 at this point. And 2/3, that's about 2/3 of the way between here and here. I might be a little bit low with that. Probably should be just a little higher, so let's do that. Okay? So right there's 2/3 of the way between here and here. Why does it have to be 2/3? Why does this have to be 2/3 of this? It's so that 3/2 of this will equal this. Okay? And also you have the 2/5. Now let's see, halfway is here. 2/5 is a little lower than that, so that's going to be about here. Okay? This has to be 2/5 of this, so that this will be 5/2 of this. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you need to go back and review some of what's been done before. In any case, we can also make the argument that as we continue to move towards 0, the y values are going to continue decreasing towards 0, so we'll have the point 0, 0. So even though I want to do a lot more points than this to actually construct the graph, we're fairly safe in saying that the two graphs might look something like this. Now, let me just pose a question here. Where would the factor 9/4 graph lie? Well, 9/4 is 2 1/4. Okay? 2 1/4 lies between 3/2, which is 1 1/2, and 5/2, which is 2 1/2. And 2 1/4 is closer to 5/2 than it is to 3/2. Now, if you're not comfortable thinking in terms of fractions, and there's a very good chance you aren't, just because fractions are very poorly taught in the public schools, they're not emphasized very much. We expect the factor 9/2 graph to be something like one of these, but closer to the factor 5/2 graph than to the factor 3/2 graph. So we might expect that graph to be maybe here. So in positioning graphs in between others, you can ask yourself, what two numbers does a factor lie between, and then how should the graph compare to the two graphs it lies between. So that's just one hint for estimating your factor 3 and factor 4 curves. I'll also say that 3, of course, lies between 5/2 and 7/2. 4 lies a little bit beyond 7/2. You're going to have to extrapolate a little bit. Once you get the picture of all these graphs, that should not be too challenging, at least to come up with a reasonable result. Your factor 3 curve, your log 3 divided by log 2, well, I'm going to actually calculate that because I can't do that one in my head. I'm going to have to use machinery to calculate. I prefer to use the computer over calculator. So I'm going to stop and calculate that and then come back and we'll talk about the results that we get from this model, because this is just a straightforward use of a calculator.